For 6 years, I was a full-time housewife. Every time I needed money, I had to ask my husband, and each time felt like I was begging. He gave me $1,500 a month but acted like it was some huge favor. Eventually, I had enough. I stopped doing the chores, refused to care for his mother who used a wheelchair, and even left our daughter at his office for him to look after. Then I found a job and began building my own life. When everything at home fell apart, my husband came crawling back, asking for forgiveness. Looking at my empty bank account, I finally worked up the nerve to message Mike. I asked him if he was free and could send this month's money. The message went unanswered. Annie, our daughter, tugged on my hand and asked for cake, but I had to tell her gently that we had to wait until Daddy sent money. She nodded, understanding as always, and it broke my heart. We weren't poor, far from it. How did it get this bad, where my daughter had to be careful just to ask for cake? I sent another message, this time mentioning Annie, which got a reaction. He replied with a voice message, annoyed and dismissive, saying he'd send it later and that I should stop nagging. I left it at that and started making dinner. But halfway through, Annie began vomiting and had diarrhea. I rushed her to the hospital, terrified, but Mike still hadn't sent the money. I couldn't even pay for her medicine. I called him. He picked up angry, yelling that I was like a debt collector and that he'd send the money when he had time. Then he hung up. I stood there, stunned, the phone still to my ear, tears pouring down my face. I remembered when I first met him. It was love at first sight, introduced by friends. His career was just starting then, and we married quickly. I moved in with his mother, Susan, who had been in a wheelchair for years and had a fiery temper. He asked me to quit my job to become a housewife, promising he'd give me his whole paycheck so I could run the house and care for his mom. At first, he kept that promise. But little by little, he started making excuses, money needed for work or social events. Eventually, he took back the salary card. From then on, he just transferred a few thousand each month. It started as $4,000 or $5,000, then dropped to $3,000, and finally $1,500. Even with that, he would delay, like today I'd asked twice, still nothing. And without that money, I was helpless. I had to borrow a few hundred just to get Annie her medicine. When I got home, Mike wasn't back yet, but Susan was wide awake, furious. The moment I stepped inside, she started yelling, calling me worthless and demanding I care for her. I bit my tongue, helped her up, and wheeled her into the living room. She noticed dinner wasn't ready and exploded again, complaining about Mike being hungry. I'd grown numb to it over the years. When I was newly married, her words would make me cry, and I'd run to Mike. But he never really defended me. He'd calm me down with sweet words or gifts, saying she was just in pain and that I should be patient for his sake. That evening at dinner, I asked him again for the living expenses. He mocked me, saying women had it easy just sitting at home while men earned the money. He made it sound like I chose this life, like I hadn't quit my job at his request. Susan chimed in, saying I was always pestering him and should spend less. I tried to explain that I was managing the money as best as I could, that $1,500 barely covered groceries and bills. Mike slammed his plate down, yelling that I was greedy and ungrateful. First, I tried to let it go like always. But then Susan made a comment about Annie, calling her that useless little girl, and questioning why I'd waste money on cake for her. That was it. I exploded. I shouted that $1,500 wasn't a fortune, and that he never gave me the money unless I begged. I reminded him that I once had a job, was independent, and he had begged me to quit to care for his mom. I turned to Susan, finally letting out everything I'd kept in for years. I told her she should be grateful. No one would care for her for just $1,500 a month. A real nurse would charge thousands. Mike yelled that I'd lost my mind. I told him no, I was finally thinking clearly. I was done asking for money, done taking care of the house, and done caring for his mother. He and I would take turns with Annie. Let's see how he copes without me. Ignoring their outrage, I took Annie and went to my room. I thought Annie might be scared, but she looked up at me and said, "Mommy, you were amazing today." I told her if I started working again, I might have less time for her. She smiled and said, "I'm already 5. My teachers will help at school, and I can take care of myself on weekends." I hugged her tight, crying. She was the only good thing from my marriage. That night I resolved never to go back. I expected Mike and Susan might last a few days without me. Turns out they didn't even last one. At 10 p.m., Mike came to me with a check and said Susan had an accident. Could I go clean it up? Clearly, he couldn't handle even one night on his own. I handed the check back. I told him I wouldn't take his money anymore. He begged, even offered double $3000, but I refused again. Mike lost his temper and said if I kept acting like this, he wouldn't give me another cent. I didn't care. I told him I'd earn my own money. I pushed him out of the room and let him deal with Susan himself. The next morning she started shouting again, demanding breakfast. I laughed and told her I wasn't the same woman anymore. I reminded her that Mike, her son, was now responsible for her. Susan panicked and tried to change her tone, smiling and acting sweet. But it was too late. I made breakfast only for Annie and me. Susan sat there furious and hungry. When she yelled that I was heartless, I replied calmly that Mike had left her alone. If she was being starved, it was his fault, not mine. After breakfast, I took Annie and left. If Mike thought I did nothing, let him manage on his own. I went straight to his office with Annie. As soon as he saw us, his face darkened. He shouted that his mom had called complaining. I calmly reminded him. I had said last night I was done. Parenting Annie was now a shared job. Mike, embarrassed in front of coworkers, lowered his voice and asked why I was there. I told him I was busy too, looking for a job. Since this was now an equal partnership, he could take care of Annie today. Right on cue, Annie ran over and said, "Daddy, it's your turn." Mike was furious, saying he couldn't bring a kid to work. I told him that was his problem and walked away. I went straight to a domestic staffing agency. I didn't have fancy qualifications, but years of housekeeping had made me skilled. To my surprise, I aced 2 interviews. They said they'd call me for trial work soon. I felt hopeful for the first time in years. At least now, I'd get paid and be respected for the work I did. Just then my phone rang. It was Annie crying. She told me Mike got scolded at work and left her outside. Alone. My heart dropped. I rushed to find her. She was safe but terrified. I held back my emotions. If I gave in now, Mike would use this as a way to pull me back in. Then I got an idea, a way to make sure he'd never do this again. I called the police. "Hello. I'd like to report a case of child abandonment." They responded quickly. A kind female officer calmed Annie down. They tracked Mike down and confronted him at work. He stammered, saying it was a misunderstanding. The officer was firm. What if something had happened to her? Seeing my chance, I stepped in and let it all out. I shouted at Mike, reminding him I had raised Annie, taken care of his mother, and asked for so little in return. I'd had enough. I had tried everything, but he'd thrown our daughter away like she didn't matter. Now he would finally face the consequences. As soon as I stormed into the office, Mike's coworkers, already curious about the noise, got a front row view of the chaos. My shouting only pulled them in further, and they gathered around, visibly intrigued. Mike started sweating, clearly panicking. "I never refused to give you money," he insisted. "Let's go home and talk." But I wasn't letting him off the hook. Right in front of everyone, I pulled out message screenshots showing how I had begged him for help, only to be met with cold, dismissive replies. I turned to the onlookers. "Judge for yourselves," I said. Before marrying Mike, I had a job and supported myself. He was the one who begged me to quit, to stay home and care for his paralyzed mother. And this is the thanks I get. The combination of my teary voice and the clear evidence shifted everyone's sympathy. Pity for me turned quickly into disgust for Mike. Even the men in the room looked ashamed to be associated with him. Flustered, Mike lunged forward and tried to grab me. I stepped back, hiding behind the police officer. "Please don't hit me," I said, pretending to be terrified. The female officer immediately moved between us. "Sir, you've abandoned your child, and now you're trying to assault your wife. You'll need to give a statement at the station." So, both of us were escorted to the station. Mike's embarrassment was complete. There, he was only let go after repeatedly promising he would never abandon his daughter again. On the way home he held it together, but once we got inside he exploded. "Mandy, are you crazy? You stormed into my job. Do you want me to get fired? How are you going to survive then?" I met his outburst with calm defiance. "I'll be fine. I'm getting a job." He laughed sarcastically. "Who's going to hire you after all this time out of work?" I reminded him that I had years of experience managing the household and caring for his mother. Plenty of agencies would take me. He scoffed. "You're planning to be a maid? That's your solution." I couldn't help laughing. There's nothing wrong with honest work. At least someone else will respect me and pay me what I deserve. As a maid, I'd make $7,000 a month. That's a huge step up from the $1,500 you begrudgingly hand me while treating me like garbage. Before we could go any further, Susan's voice cut in. "Mike, stop yelling and make me something to eat." Mike sighed, trying to keep calm, and muttered, "Fine. I'm done arguing. Just make dinner. Mom and Annie are hungry." I was hungry too, so I went to the kitchen. But when dinner was ready, I only served myself and Annie. When Mike tried to grab a plate, I stopped him. "This is for Annie and me. You and your mom can cook for yourselves." His face darkened with anger. "Are you serious? Do you even want to stay married? This is my house. If you don't cooperate, we can divorce. Let's see where you go then." I laughed coldly. "Of course. The divorce threat. How original." I reminded him that while he paid for the house, I'd contributed in labor, time, and sacrifice. "Do you even know how much full-time caregiving costs? $5,000 a month. More if it's for someone disabled. You've barely given me $3,000 a month all these years. Let's do the math. Deduct rent and then pay me for years of caregiving. Let's see who really owes who." Mike turned red, stammering with no comeback. In the end, he had to cook for himself and Susan. He made spaghetti, but Susan spit it out at the first bite, complaining it was too salty. She eyed Annie's lemon shrimp with envy. But this was just the beginning. From then on, I stopped doing anything for Mike or Susan. I cooked and cleaned only for myself and Annie. The house descended into disorder. Susan especially suffered. On some days, she soiled herself and had no one to clean her. She cried and wailed, wishing for death. The mess and the non-stop complaints pushed Mike to the edge. After weeks of this, he finally cracked. One day, while Susan made a scene during his video conference, screaming about needing help, he reached his breaking point. After the call, he came to me crying, "Mandy, I'm sorry. I know I messed up. Please forgive me. I'll send money on time $3000. No, for $1,000 a month." In the past, I might have forgiven him, but not anymore. I didn't need him. I'd already accepted a job through a domestic staffing agency to care for a woman who was a double amputee with a rough personality, for $7,000 a month. That was nothing new for me. After dealing with Susan, I could handle anything. They were impressed by my caregiving experience and wanted me to start the next day. I looked Mike in the eye and smirked. $4,000? Who are you fooling? He scrambled, changing tactics. "Okay, fine, I'll give you my entire paycheck. Let's go back to how it was." I laughed louder this time, just enough for Susan to hear. "Too late. I've got a new job. Live-in caregiver. $7,000 a month." Mike scoffed. $7,000? For a maid? You're being conned. Not at all, I replied. They pay well because their mother has driven off every other caregiver. But I'm not scared. No one can be worse than your mom. Susan, listening from her room, wheeled herself out in a panic. You're leaving to care for someone else? What about me? I stared at her with a smirk. Ask your dear son to hire someone. But with your attitude, that'll cost at least $10,000 a month. Good luck. Mike makes $5,000, so good luck affording dinner. Mike turned red again. Fine. That's how it is, get out. Pay rent or leave. Without blinking, I took out my phone and sent a voice message. Hi, Miss Lucy. I'm accepting your offer for live-in care. I can start tomorrow. She replied almost instantly, grateful. Thank you, Mandy. You're a lifesaver. So few people are willing to stay. We'll add $500 to your pay. I thanked her sweetly and hung up. I turned to Mike and Susan. See? Some people value me and pay me extra. Honestly, I should thank you, Susan. Without your nastiness, I wouldn't be this tough. They stood frozen, speechless. Susan, still trying to save face, snapped at Mike. Hire a maid. I won't believe she's the best we can do. I packed up, took Annie, and moved out. Susan tried to convince Mike to use Annie as leverage, but after the police incident, Mike knew better. I explained my situation to my new employer, and she agreed Annie could stay with me as long as she didn't interfere. Out of gratitude, I turned down the extra $500 raise, saying that a safe home with my daughter was enough. Annie and I settled into our new life. Meanwhile, Susan and Mike struggled. My neighbor kept me updated with stories of the chaos. Mike first hired a cheap maid, but Susan quickly started criticizing everything. Her cooking, her work, her tone. The maid quit soon after. Mike then hired a more experienced, better-paid caregiver. But even she couldn't handle Susan's attitude for long and left. With his job becoming more demanding, Mike was overwhelmed. One night, after the second maid quit and Susan insulted him, Mike lost it. It's your fault. If you hadn't been awful to Mandy, she wouldn't have left. Hearing that from my neighbor made me roll my eyes. Typical Mike, blaming Susan entirely, as if he wasn't equally at fault. Sure, Susan was a nightmare, but I left because of both of them. I gave up my independence to care for them and was treated like trash. Blaming just Susan was his way of avoiding accountability. Eventually, I decided to see the mess for myself. At the end of the month, I took a day off, dressed to perfection, and visited. I walked in to find Susan yelling at her third maid, a woman about her age. You're useless. I call for water and you take forever. You should be the employer. When she saw me, her tone shifted instantly. Mandy. Finally. Look at this maid. You were perfect. You just knew when I needed help. This one doesn't even bring water without a fight. But the maid had had enough. Oh, now you remember how good she was? I've heard all about you from your neighbors. They said you treated her terribly, even after she gave everything to serve you. You never deserved her loyalty. You pushed her away and now you're stuck with someone like me. But guess what? I'm leaving too. You really think I'll stick around for $2,000 a month just to be mistreated? Keep dreaming. The maid ripped off her apron, flung it at Susan, and stormed out. Susan stood there furious. She looked like steam was pouring from her ears. Now that the maid was gone, she had no one else to take her anger out on, except me. Suddenly she started crying and begging. Mandy, life without you has been horrible. These new maids are so heartless. They take my money but give me no care. I was wrong. You were the best. Please come back. I'll treat you better this time. Hearing her, my chest tightened, not from sympathy but from disbelief. How had I let myself get to this point? For years, I'd let her humiliate and use me, even though she could barely function without my help. If I'd stood up for myself earlier, if I'd quit the moment things became unbearable, would either Susan or Mike have dared to treat me so badly? Probably not. I realized I had handed them the power to mistreat me by not valuing myself. Without saying a word, I went to my room and began packing the last of Annie's and my things. This house would never be home again. Once we were fully moved out, I planned to file for divorce. I needed to sever all ties with both Mike and Susan and start over. Somehow, Susan must have sensed what I was planning because she started panicking. "What are you doing? Where are you going? You're just walking out on your husband and me." I ignored her and kept packing. That silence sent her into a rage. "I knew it. You're selfish. You'd rather care for strangers than your own family. You heartless witch. I'll sue you for abandoning us." That was the last straw. I turned and snapped, "Go ahead. Sue me. Let's see what the court thinks. I spent 6 years slaving in this house, being insulted and belittled every day. Do you really think the law will take your side? A bitter, abusive old hag." She stammered, furious. "Don't you dare." But I cut her off. "Insult me again and I swear, I'll slap you so hard you'll think twice before opening that mouth. I've put up with this for too long. You think I'm weak? Think again." For once she had no response. As I finished packing, I noticed 2 of Annie's Barbie dolls out on the balcony. When I walked over to get them, Susan shrieked like a madwoman and threw a mug at me. "You Blackheart witch. I'll kill you." I ducked instinctively. The mug soared past me out the open balcony door and straight down. We were on the 10th floor. My heart froze. If it hit someone, it could be fatal. I rushed to the balcony and looked over. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The mug had struck a man directly in the head. He staggered, then collapsed in a pool of blood. I turned around furious. "Susan, do you even understand what you just did? That could have killed someone. Do you think Mike has the money to cover this?" Her face turned pale, but she quickly lashed out. "It's your fault. If you hadn't moved, I wouldn't have missed. You're the one who'll pay, not me." I gave a bitter laugh. "Tell that to the police. Your fingerprints are all over that mug. You're going to pay for this, Susan." I raced downstairs and called 911. As I got closer to the injured man, my stomach dropped. It was Mike. By the time the ambulance got him to the hospital, it was too late. The mug had killed him instantly. When Susan found out, she collapsed into a fit of sobs. "My son, my poor boy. How could this happen?" Her cries echoed through the halls. But soon her grief turned into rage. She pointed at me with shaking hands. "This is your fault. You cursed my son. It should have been you who died." Some people never take responsibility. They'll always blame someone else. But I was done letting Susan walk all over me. I met her rage with my own. "Your son is dead because of you. You killed him. You're the one who should have died." For a second, I understood why Susan always used cruel words. It felt powerful to finally let out all that pain. But I also knew holding on to hatred would never heal anything. After saying my piece, I walked away. I had more important things to handle, like securing Mike's estate. After Mike's death, I reported what happened. But since Susan was paralyzed from the waist down, any sentence she'd get would be served outside prison. Taking legal action felt pointless. Mike was gone, and I wanted nothing more to do with her. Though she did receive part of the estate, life wouldn't be easy for her. The inheritance was split among Annie, Susan, and me. Everything was divided according to law. I even left the house to Susan, doing the last decent thing I could as Mike's widow. But I knew what would come next. Sure enough, her greedy maternal relatives came sniffing around once they realized she had money. That wasn't my concern anymore. I was focused on Annie and starting a better life. Years passed, and eventually I heard Susan had died. I hadn't planned to deal with her funeral, but when I learned she left part of her inheritance to Annie, I came back to take care of things. That's when I discovered what her final years were like. Distrustful of outsiders and obsessed with protecting her money, she made a deal with a nephew, care for her until death, and he'd get the house. First it worked. He moved in with his wife and kids, and they even signed a legal agreement. But Susan's attitude hadn't changed. She clashed with the wife constantly, and the nephew eventually sided with his spouse. It didn't take long before they started mistreating Susan. They wanted her out of the way so they could take the house. But Susan had one last trick. Without telling anyone, she revised her will and left the house to Annie instead. When she died, her nephew was livid. He tried to contest the will, but I brought in the authorities to make sure the law was followed. The will was valid, he had no claim. I buried Susan, sold the house, and used the money to move on with Annie. The nephew could complain all he wanted, but there was nothing he could do. Some thought maybe Susan had a change of heart at the end, leaving the house to Annie. But I knew better. She never cared about us. She just hated the idea of her greedy nephew winning. If she truly cared, she would have used that house to make me stay and take care of her. But her spiteful revenge ended up working in our favor. Her own family fell apart fighting over her. And in the end, the house came right back to Annie. Years later, as I watched Annie grow into a kind, confident young woman, I often thought back to the life we left behind. The pain, the chaos, the cruelty. It all felt like a distant nightmare. The house, the inheritance, the battles, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we were free. Free from the chains of a toxic past. Free to build something better. Annie would sometimes ask about her father or Susan, and I would tell her only what she needed to know, not to shelter her, but to protect her from the bitterness that once consumed me. She didn't need to inherit our wounds. She deserved a future unshaped by hatred. And as for me, I finally learned what real strength looked like. It wasn't staying silent. It wasn't enduring abuse. Strength was walking away even when your legs tremble. It was choosing peace over war, and healing over vengeance. In the end, the house that once symbolized control and cruelty became the very thing that helped us escape. Susan's final act, whether born of spite or guilt, gave Annie the foundation for a new life. And I made sure we honored that gift, not for Susan but for ourselves. We didn't just survive. We started over. We found joy. We built a life rooted in love, not obligation. And every time the sun rose through our new windows, I knew we were finally truly home.